Hello, and welcome to another video essay. Today, this will be about the destroyers of the Gerard Callenburgh-class, starting with their political and design history, their particulars, their unique service on both sides of the war, and ending with an analysis and comparison. The political background is relatively brief, but tumultuous. In 1922, the commission chaired by Goossens had evaluated the needs of the Navy after the First World War. For the defense of the Dutch East Indies, they required, amongst other material, a fleet of 4 cruisers, 24 destroyers, and 32 attack submarines. A draft fleet law was set up, however, Van Dijk noted that this would find some resistance in Parliament, most notably because of concerns of long-term commitment. He thus recommended Goossens to change the plan from a fleet law in 12 years to a 6-year plan of the half minimum. In the meantime, yearly budgets would be requested to expand the Navy according to its guidelines. Van Dijk's foresight may have been impeccable, as Parliament dragged its feet, and by the time of the voting, some rebellious actions caused the fleet law to be rejected 50-49, and a huge scandal erupted as Parliament exploded, figuratively. Fortunately, 8 destroyers managed to come true. These would consist of 4 pairs, one being ordered each fiscal year. Collectively, these ships will be known as the De Ruyter or Admiralen-class. They're often split into the Van Gent and Van Galen-class, as those show the most difference, but technically the ships are divided into 4 different models, with the last pair being the Van Ness type. In 1930, Minister Dekkers came with a fleet plan to remedy the situation. This included a cruiser, 2 leaders, and the subject of this video, 4 destroyers. Design history. When the next batch of destroyers was planned, it was initially expected that they would be of an improved Admiralen-class type. So, using the Van Ness class as the basis, it was looked at what could be improved. The 7.5 cm gun amidships was deemed unsatisfactory, and the possibility of replacing it with a 5th 12 cm gun was considered, but deemed not feasible without significant changes. Thus, the gun was dropped entirely. The other 4 main guns would be merged into 2 twin mounts of higher elevation and with a 10 mm shield. This would, besides saving the weight and crew, also have the benefit of allowing the bridge complex to be lowered, which on the previous Admiralen ships caused some top weight concerns. The 40 mm 2-pounder guns would be replaced by new Bofors guns, placed into 2 twin mounts on the aft deck house. Modifications to the torpedo battery for heavier torpedoes would be minimal, and it will be endeavored to increase the reserve torpedo count from 4 to 6. Further changes were made to the bridge and fire control, as well as more minor modernizations throughout the ship. All changes combined would ultimately increase the weight of this improved design with a total of 6.4 tons. However, it was observed that other countries had increased the speed and armament of their destroyers during the construction break of 9 years since the last series. Considering the new Dutch destroyers would have these as their peers for many years in the future, it was advised to match this pace. Other arguments for enlargement was a desire for a higher cruise speed and operational range. For these features, a 280-ton increase would grant a top speed of 36 knots in tropical conditions, a 5th 12 cm gun, a new operational range of 7,000 nautical miles, and a cruise speed of 20 knots. The new requirements of the 1600-ton version were set up. The second rangefinder was removed, and the 40 mm machine guns were spread out to super firing positions fore and aft. The 12.7 mm machine guns were to be in twin mounts, the searchlight was moved to the position between the torpedo tubes, and the 5th gun was located between the funnels. Shortly after the new requirements and design were drafted, a new proposal called Plan A was approved. This involved moving the carried aircraft to between the funnels, and the single main battery mount will be moved to the aft deck house. Replacement of the single mount with a twin was being considered, but did not appear to be feasible due to the weight associated. The triple torpedo tubes were in principle to be replaced with quadruple mounts, with reserve torpedoes dropped to accommodate this change. The steering hut would be protected with 10 mm of vertical and 20 mm of horizontal armor. A quick-firing cannon of 1.1 ton was added. Depth charge throwers were reduced to 2 pieces aft and a single depth charge rack was added. Other changes made were the movement of 12.7 mm machine guns to adjacent aft the funnel. Early machinery estimations suspected a need of 42,000 shaft horsepower to achieve the required speed of 36 knots. To maintain this speed in the tropics, 50,000 shaft horsepower was estimated. Yarrow proposed a set of 2 side-fired boilers of 42,000 shaft horsepower, and another project with 3 side-fired boilers was noted. After clarification with the chef of the marine staff, it was requested from Yarrow to come up with versions of both projects of 44,000 shaft horsepower, and from Werkspoor a project with 3 boilers of the same power. On the finished project, 3 Werkspoor boilers totaling 45,000 shaft horsepower were chosen. On the 16th of May 1938, chef of the marine staff proposed the following 4 names for the destroyers: Jan van Riebeck, Abel Tasman, Tjerk Hiddes, and Philips van Almonde. However, the eventual picked names for these ships were Gerard Callenburgh, Tjerk Hiddes, Isaac Sweers, and Philips van Almonde. Particulars of the pre-war design. The dimensions were as followed: 105 meter waterline length at trial displacement and 106.30 meter length overall. 10.30 meter beam, 6.17 meter height, 3.10 meter draft at trial displacement, and 3.49 meter fully equipped. Our displacement was 1628 ton, passing ton standard, 1922 ton trial, and 2252 ton fully equipped. Fuel stowage, including diesel, was just under 573 tons. Armament consisted of 5 Wilton Feyenoord produced 12 cm 46 caliber guns in 2 twin numero 8 mounts of 45 degree elevation and 1 numero 6 light shield mount of 55 degree elevation. Both were provided with a 10 mm shield. Medium anti-air was 4 40 mm Bofors AA guns in 2 twin stabilized Hasemeyer mounts and 4 12.7 mm machine guns in 2 twin mounts. Torpedo armament was 2 quadruple mounts of 53 cm diameter with angles up to 38 degrees aft and 43 degrees fore and an additional 7 degrees from the spread. Other armaments were 2 Vickers depth charge throwers and a rail with 9 depth charges, as well as an option to carry and lay 24 mines of model 1921 when fitted with detachable rails. Further equipment consisted of a quick-fire cannon and 2 hydrophones. Beside the gun shields, the bridge was protected against small automatic fire with 10 mm vertical and 20 mm horizontal armor. Machinery consisted of 3 Werkspoor Yarrow boilers produced at the respective shipyards and 2 sets of Werkspoor Parson gear turbines driving the 2 screws with 45,000 shaft horsepower. The machinery could produce an extra 10% if necessary. The cruise speed was 20 knots and range was 7,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Of the 4 destroyers, the former 2, Gerard Callenburgh and Tjerk Hiddes, were being constructed at de Rotterdamse Droogdokmaatschappij. The latter 2, Isaac Sweers and Philips van Almonde, were being constructed at de Koninklijke Maatschappij de Schelde in Vlissingen. Before the outbreak of World War II, 3 out of the 4 ships were already launched. The Philips van Almonde, which was still on the stocks, could not be launched during World War II due to the Rijkswaterstaat being unable to increase the water level of the inner harbor. A later attempt was also thwarted due to damage and, consequently, she was scuttled on the stocks. The ships at Rotterdam fared no better either. Delays due to magnetic mines and lack of tugboats resulted in the ships being scuttled as well. By contrast, the Isaac Sweers escape went smoothly. The tugboat Zwarte Zee departed from Terneuzen and was welcomed in Vlissingen by a German firebomb attack, which burned a hole in her portside sloop. She departed with Isaac Sweers the next night. North of Nieuwesluis, they were attacked by a German formation of aircraft dropping magnetic mines, which were fortunately dodged. Subsequently, the voyage remained uneventful, and they arrived at the Downs the morning of the 11th, after which they were redirected to Portsmouth. A month later, she would start completion at John I. Thornycroft Limited in Portsmouth. However, before we focus on her completion, we need to have some context. For this, we have two important venues that need to be explained. Firstly, we have to go to Hengelo, where a vital producer for ship fire control systems was located, namely Hazemeyer Signaalapparaten. It is here that a number of important people met, of which four notable names were Assistant Director J.J.A. Schagen van Leeuwen, and amongst his staff H.C. Akkerman, Buitenhuis, Kuivenhoven, and numerous army NCO's. During the German invasion of the Netherlands, the entourage went on bicycles and headed for Zwolle to head behind the IJssellinie. The plan swiftly changed to Zwartsluis, but after arriving and seeing Zwartsluis overrun with German troops, they changed course to Vollenhoven, where the major arranged transport to Harderwijk. The group subsequently managed to attain passage from Harderwijk to Edam. From here, the members split up in various directions, but shortly after, the main quartet ended up at Den Helder. The Hazemeyer Four were joined by a number of naval officers, amongst which Houtsmuller and Harbesen. Here, they managed to escape to Great Yarmouth using a simple motorboat for torpedo chasing. Another important place was het meetgebouw of Commissie Fysische Strijdmiddelen in Waalsdorp near The Hague. This army research lab had developed their own radar under von Weiler. Max Staal, who was in Drenthe at the time of the invasion, crossed the Afsluitdijk on his motorbike. He joined von Weiler, and in the morning of the 14th of May, they grabbed as many blueprints and knowledge of the radar and fled from Scheveningen to England. Meanwhile, Engineer Pickett had managed to escape together with two of the four produced radar sets to England. Isaac Sweers had arrived in Britain without armament and fire control. Shortly later, a consensus on what to armor with was reached, namely 3 twin 4-inch dual-purpose mounts in the position of the original main battery, a quadruple 2-pounder AA mount was to be placed on the aft AA platform, 2 quad 12.7mm machine guns were to be placed on sponsons behind the aft funnel, and 2 12.7mm machine guns were to be placed abreast the bridge. Further equipment would be a dual-purpose fire control system, quad torpedo launchers like the original design, and anti-submarine warfare equipment including depth charges and ASDIC. However, she would not commission with this intended loadout as planned. The quad machine guns ended up being placed between the funnels. But more importantly, another ship, the Hare Majesteits Willem van der Zaan, had arrived in the United Kingdom, along with her 40mm Hazemeyer AA mountings, which were disembarked, and after one of them was disassembled and studies were made, they were returned to the Koninklijke Marine. This allowed for the abandonment of the quad 2-pounder AA mount, and instead, the Isaac Sweers received the two Hazemeyer 40mm mounts in the original intended positions. These would become exceptionally special, because it was decided to marry these modern mounts to the radar sets Pickett had evacuated. Von Weiler and Staal integrated these and had custom Yagi aerials made. As a result, the RDF 289 Dutch radar was born. Furthermore, Isaac Sweers received a rangefinder and director Mark V star with RDF 285. To make sure this all worked, von Weiler joined her on the first few voyages, for which he was given a rank in the Navy. Hare Majesteits Isaac Sweers was commissioned on the 29th of May 1941. Her captain was J. Houtsmuller, a radio and ASDIC specialist among those who escaped from Den Helder. She did extensive trials, and in the Firth of Clyde she managed to run 36.7 knots on 9 heaters, and on average scored a top speed of 37.5 knots. At maximum, she achieved speeds above 38 knots. Her first few missions were a number of escorts after which on the 6th of September she set out to join Force H at Gibraltar, where she arrived on the 24th. The same day of her arrival, she was assigned to participate in Operation Halbert. She was to join Force A under the HMS Nelson, which further consisted of HMS Rodney, HMS Prince of Wales, HMS Ark Royal, and 8 destroyers including the Zerstörer. Separate from this was Force X in charge of the near convoy escort under HMS Kenya, the cruisers, and remaining 10 destroyers. On the 27th, they were attacked by multiple waves of Italian torpedo bombers. The destroyer screen successfully parried the attack in general, although the Zerstörer was hit by her own allies' barrage and consequently suffered 2 wounded on board. Subsequently, there was an attempt to force a surface action against a nearby Italian fleet, but this led to no avail. After more convoy escorts, the Zerstörer participated in Operation Perpetual. During this, a pair of German submarines managed to torpedo the HMS Ark Royal on the 14th of November. She almost made it back home, but a fire broke out in her portside boiler room and she lost steam pressure. Efforts were made to recover the ship, however, a lack of power resulted in the ultimate loss, which may have been preventable had the manport to the switch room not been left open, or the adjacent destroyer, HMS Laforey, that would provide backup electricity not been delayed by 2 hours due to lack of steam. Zerstörer then participated in numerous searches for the submarines, but due to layers between seawater of different salinity, this proved fruitless. In early December, the Zerstörer joined the HMS destroyers Sick, Legion, and Maori to reinforce the eastern Mediterranean forces. They departed early on the 11th. Somewhere during the next day, they were spotted by a reconnaissance plane. A few days earlier, Italian Admiral Antonino Toscano had been trying to supply fuel to Tripoli with his cruisers Alberico da Barbiano, Alberto di Gisano, and torpedoboat Cigno. However, he had been spotted and attacked by aircraft. On the 12th, he was informed about the 4 Allied destroyers steaming, but was assured they would not make Cape Bon until 3 past midnight on the 13th. Under a revised plan and orders, he sailed out. However, he was delayed by 1 hour and was further spotted by aircraft from Malta. Meanwhile, the Allied destroyers were ahead of Italian schedule. They did not only go 26 knots instead of the expected 20 knots, but had also increased speed to 30 knots upon receiving word from Malta that they would pass the Italian cruisers around 1 past midnight. Around 2:20 past midnight, the destroyers spotted the Italian cruisers disappearing behind Cape Bon. Upon this, the captain aboard HMS Sick, G.H. Stokes, formed his ships close to the coastline in order to remain undetected. They were sailing line ahead in the order Sick, Legion, Maori, Zerstörer. Coincidentally, Toscano had ordered his fleet around, most likely in accordance with his orders, and because he was under the impression that he was spotted by enemy aircraft. This maneuver resulted in both fleets approaching each other at high speed. At around 2:22 past midnight, they made contact with Alberico da Barbiano in front, followed by Alberto di Gisano and ultimately Cigno. Due to the immense speed, the encounter was very swift. HMS Sick was in front and fired a salvo of 3 torpedoes at the foremost cruiser and engaged the second with guns. 2 out of 3 torpedoes exploded and lit the Barbiano fore and aft aflame. The second cruiser Gisano fired but overshot and was swiftly silenced by 3 salvos of Sick. The Legion fired 6 torpedoes on the second cruiser, of which only 1 hit, and subsequently the Maori made contact with the first and brought her guns to bear, scoring a few hits on the bridge, after which she fired 2 torpedoes and hit 1 of them. Next was the Zerstörer. She encountered the second ship on fire, and after being identified as an Italian cruiser, she fired and flashes were observed. A few seconds later, a silhouette appeared which was initially suspected to be the Legion, but once recognized to be an Italian torpedo boat of the Clemente class, she opened fire and scored 7 hits, among those on the bridge and the aft steering arrangement. A single torpedo was fired on shallow setting at 200 meters distance, but despite this most likely passed underneath the Cigno. The encounter resulted in the sinking of both Italian cruisers, which were laden with fuel for delivery. The Cigno attempted to rescue as many lives as possible, but this task proved arduous with the burning fuel and in addition many air attacks. In the aftermath, the Italians reported the Sweers as sunk, most likely to downplay the bad news of the action. Because the formation was operating at radio silence, this was assumed to be true for a moment, until she safely arrived in Malta. Not soon after the Battle of Cape Bon, the destroyers were tasked to proceed to Alexandria and join a convoy on the way. During the 17th, the fleet was attacked by around 25 torpedo bombers and 50 Junker 88s. Sweers was attacked multiple times, but distinguished herself greatly. Shortly later, another Italian convoy, escorted by battleships, passed nearby and engaged the Allied fleet. The engagement was short and no significant results were made, ending the First Battle of Sirte. After arriving at Alexandria and running some anti-submarine patrols, command was changed from J. Houtsmuller to J. Harmsen. Convoying resumed, and on the 8th of January, 10 before 5 in the evening, HMS Legion spotted a surface submarine. Guns were fired, and Sweers managed to get Aztec contact, after which she dropped 3 salvos of 5 charges. The U-374 escaped but was badly damaged and unable to submerge. Consequently, she was sunk 4 days later. Convoying from Alexandria proved more exciting for the crews, as enemy presence was much greater than from Gibraltar. On the 17th, at 7:39 in the morning, HMS Gurkha was hit by a torpedo from an enemy submarine. She was engulfed in fire, and spilling oil turned the sea into one of flames. Sweers managed to engage in rescue operations and save many of Gurkha's crew despite the imminent danger and exploding munitions. Back in Alexandria, a deputation of the former HMS Gurkha offered a dog to Sweers, which was named Gurkha and became a mascot on board. On the 23rd, it was decided to send her to the Far East. She arrived the 8th of February and had to go in dock for brief repairs and maintenance, something that can be seen as amazing, as she had run over 70,000 nautical miles without repairs nor extensive trials. Unfortunately, it would take some time due to the American cruiser USS Boyce receiving priority. On the night between the 27th and 28th, she finally departed for the Dutch East Indies, but midway she received orders to return if possible. Intelligence expected a Japanese air attack on Ceylon on the 1st of April. Therefore, Admiral Somerville of the Royal Navy decided to head out in the hopes of being able to do a night air attack. His forces were split between Force A, which formed the fast division with HMS Warspite Indomitable and Formidable at the head, and Force B, with the 4 slower R-class battleships, and Hermes, as well as having the Hare Majesteits Sweers and Jacob van Heemskerk amongst the escorts. They departed on the 29th. After 3 nights, Somerville was forced to return to port due to his ships not being designed for tropical service and lacking water distillation equipment. On the 4th of April, a Catalina spotted a large enemy formation 360 nautical miles southeast of Ceylon. The morning of the next day, Colombo was attacked by a large air fleet, and in the afternoon, the cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and Cornwall were sunk at sea. Trincomalee was attacked in the morning of the 9th, and shortly after this, the returning HMS Hermes, Vampire, Acrobat, and 2 tankers were sunk as well. Somerville, who was plagued by a lack of long-range reconnaissance, decided to keep his Force A nearby as a fleet in being and sent Force B to Mombasa. The following month proceeded uneventfully, and on the 22nd of May, it was announced that the Sweers would return to England to repair wear and tear. In the end of June that year, she went in for dry docking at Thornycroft Limited. Her boiler fronts were adjusted, and she received 20mm guns in place of her quad 12.7mm machine guns. Her depth charge arrangement was adjusted so she could drop patterns of 10 instead of 5 charges. Furthermore, her Aztec installation was modernized, and I assume this is also when she got shields on her torpedo tubes. She went to Portsmouth in the latter half of September for trials, which had shown she needed deck reinforcements around her new 20mm guns. She later departed to Scapa Flow for further exercises, which were cut short when she was directed to escort HMS Furious to Gibraltar. She joined the Operation Torch together with HMS Porcupine and stayed in the rear lines. On the 11th of November, the unescorted MS New Zealand was torpedoed 60 miles off from Gibraltar. Sweers rescued most of the survivors, with only 14 out of the 260 ended up missing. After bringing them to safety at Gibraltar, she was ordered to rendezvous with Force H. Harmison wished to refuel at the safety of Gibraltar, but was directed to load fuel at the tanker convoy Force R. There, she refueled over the night between the 12th and 13th, and was to stay near the convoy. She remained uninformed about the position and course, and, due to the dark night and bad weather, had to slow down to 38 knots and stay close. Her squadron mate, HMS Porcupine, in the meantime, had lost contact with the fleet around half an hour before midnight. At 5:29 in the morning, the Sweers was struck by 2 torpedoes, both on the starboard side, one near the bridge and one near the aft funnel. Fire spread around the entire starboard side, and around 5:36 the ship broke in two, with the stern sinking to the bottom. The fore section of the ship remained floating and had to be sunk by gunfire from the HMS Puckeridge. Rescue was difficult due to the fires, and survivors further reported the water being torn apart by depth charges from British destroyers. In the end, 108 of the 194 crew members were lost. Zerstörer Holland. The 3 new destroyer hulls remaining in the Netherlands were all scuttled. Philips van Almonde, being blown up on the stocks, was immediately written off, whilst Gerard Callenburgh and Tjerk Hiddes had to be raised from the new mass. Of those 2, Gerard Callenburgh was deemed the effort to make her serviceable. She was finished at Bloemenvos, Hamburg, and commissioned as ZH-1 in early October 1942. Tangentially, remaining equipment for turbines and spare industry prompted the Germans to design and order new ships based on the original machinery. These would become the Zerstörer 40 or later Vlotten torpedoboot 40 type destroyers, of which none will be commissioned until the war's end. For ZH-1, it took another year after commissioning before she was operationally deployed. Between the 2nd and 4th of November of 1943, she and Z-27 went south through the English Channel. They were engaged by Dover's coastal batteries, of which no hit was incurred, and motor torpedo boats en route, which were also successfully parried. ZH-1 unfortunately suffered from issues with salinity in her turbine and consequently had to be docked until February 1944. Some exercises and escort missions later, the Allied armies landed on the Normandy beaches. ZH-1, along with Z-32 and Z-24, headed to Brest, and underway they were twice attacked by enemy aircraft. On the 8th of June, the destroyers, along with torpedo boat T-24, sailed out to engage the enemy landing forces. That night, they were engaged by 8 Allied destroyers. The German destroyers launched 4 torpedoes each, but this was unsuccessful due to the Allied ships being equipped to intercept German shortwave ship-to-ship commands. The Germans were badly hit by gunfire, and ZH-1 suffered a shell in her fore boiler room and in the main steam line of the turbine room. A further torpedo hit was incurred from HMS Tartar, and both diesel generators were started, but power was still unavailable. She managed to escape from the engagement in smoke, but a while later contact was resumed between her and the Allied destroyers HMS Tartar and Ashanti. Tartar was still ablaze from the fighting and engaged by ZH-1's aft guns, although the munition hoists were not operational due to lack of power. Meanwhile, Ashanti was being engaged by the forward gun. Ashanti managed to torpedo ZH-1's bow off, but ZH-1's guns continued to engage as he fired the remaining 4 torpedoes manually without avail. The captain decided to scuttle the ZH-1, and at 2:40 past midnight she exploded and sank. 39 of her crew were lost. Meanwhile, Tartar did not come out unscathed and suffered 4 lost, 12 wounded, and she lost all radar and radio communication with her foremast hanging off the side. Analysis and comparison. The Dutch 1937-38 destroyers belong in the category of the 1600 some ton destroyers before the war. However, by their time of construction, most destroyers were closer akin to 1800 some ton in size, if not 2000. Compared to the 1650 tonners like the Italian Alfredo Oriani, Mistral, the Soviet Nefny, and the United States Benham, we find the Dutch design to be highly competitive, eclipsing her displacement peers in virtually all respects. But a year or two later, roughly matching the planned commission date of the Dutch orders, we find the destroyers like the Hardy, the JKN, Tribal, Glies, Storosevoy, and Soldati classes, entering service with a displacement roughly 200 tons heavier. These are more akin her true peers and boast similar firepower and torpedo armament, except for the Tribal, which has more of the former and less of the latter. The British destroyers in general have slightly more offensive power and less speed. Although individual foreign ship quirks aside, something that stands out is the AA armament of the Dutch design, as well as their larger fuel storage. Another strength in the Dutch design is their fire control. Witte de With already showed ability to punch above her weight with her central fire control in the Battle of the Java Sea, but technology had meanwhile advanced and modern cruiser systems were implemented in the Tromp class and later in the new Dutch destroyer designs. The competitiveness of them, besides being 200 tons and some crew lighter, can be seen as a testament to Dutch naval engineering and excellent quality. That said, they are not without their issues. On the design themselves, one can critique the lack of a large caliber AA battery, but this does not seem resolvable. The Russian designs brought 3-inch guns, which as previously discussed can be seen as inadequate. Meanwhile, the 4-inch guns, present on many British destroyers, came at the cost of a turret or torpedo launcher. A second remark would be the lack of unit machinery. This would be machinery that is in well-separated rooms to prevent complete loss of power if either is hit. But this was not something that was realistic at the time. What I do find to be an adequate critique is the size of the designs. With conflict looming on the horizon, many nations incrementally increased the size of their destroyers, reaching in the 2000 tons for the Japanese and 2200 tons for the German designs, and these would only go up. Especially regarding the former, which will be the visualized opponent, it may have been more prudent to aim for a design larger in size, with for instance an extra gun, second fire control position, and extra reserve systems. Another aspect to look at would be the refit of the Hare Majesteits Isaac Sweers. Her fire control was augmented with both British and Dutch systems, becoming one of, if not the most modern destroyer of her time. To go into more detail, the Dutch pre-war radar had a power output of only 1 kilowatt, but came with a J-scope display, 7.5 to 15 km range, with good accuracy, and a single antenna with TR switch. For comparison, the early British gunnery radar 282 had a 15 kilowatt and later 25 kilowatt power output, with a range of 5 to 6,000 yards, A-scope display, and separate antennas. The version on the Isaac Sweers was modified from the original. It moved from a 3x2 meter matraz to Yagi antennas. Range was increased to 22 kilometers and accuracy was refined. Unfortunately, further information on the 289 is hard to come by. For her main battery, her guns were replaced by 4-inch dual-purpose guns, which does make her firepower anemic in regards to long surface action, though her fire rate, combined with radar, can make her equally as lethal in closer range engagements or at night. Although her surface firepower can be seen as lacking, her performance against high elevation targets can be extremely valuable. Combining the strength of the original medium AA battery of the two twin 40mm Hasemeyer mounts with the long range of the 4-inch heavy AA battery and then augmenting it with the radar systems has left her, combined with her good fuel capacity, a phenomenally excellent escort. It is a shame that the Dutch strategic position and series of unfortunate events had removed this Dutch destroyer lineage from the world, but their events remain etched into our history, and their uniqueness is something to remember.